It's a crime being LGBTQ in Kenya. Homosexuality is illegal there, as it is in more than half of African countries. Same-sex relations are prohibited, and those who don't conform to expected gender identities can go to jail for up to 14 years. According to Pew Research, only 1% of Kenyan respondents said society should accept homosexuality. That was back in 2002. As of just a few years ago, 14% now believe homosexuality should be accepted. LGBTQ activists and lawyers are a big part of this societal shift. They've won some important victories and are finding ways to break through. I'm Rita Ninan on today's episode of The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, a podcast for foreign policy. We talk to human rights activists like Eric Gitari. His litigation has changed Kenyan society.
A lot of people are now able to come out without fear. There's a sense of pride across the LGBT movement.
We'll hear more about his groundbreaking work later in the show. But first, we wanted to hear from a major part of the country's LGBTQ movement, queer women and girls, as well as non-binary people. Here's more from reporter Eunice Maina.
I'm sitting in a park in Nairobi with Mary-Liz Biubwa, a leading LGBTQ activist in Kenya.
I like starting by saying I am a human being. Many a times as queer people take our humanity away from us.
Biubwa, who uses the pronouns they and them, co-founded the group Queer Republic, which connects queer people across Africa using online platforms like WhatsApp. They also help organize a lot of protests, like this one from 2022. Here, they are protesting against a proposal by the then Minister for Education, George Magoha. He wanted to ban LGBTQ students from attending boarding schools.
I said, for example, if you are a homosexual in a boarding school and you are hopping from a bed of another student to another, your rights end there.
Mary-Liz, a number of activists, and dozens of students took to the streets. Here is Mary-Liz speaking at the rally.
We will no longer stay in a system that a cabinet secretary can come up with a directive that sexualizes children.
Mary-Liz tells me they were particularly proud of this demonstration.
It was the first ever LGBTQ protest to be approved by the police. I can take pride in that.
The protesters then delivered their petition to the Ministry of Education. The proposal has not been passed to date. The fact the police provided security at an LGBTQ protest for the first time ever in Kenya was a pretty big deal. Anti-LGBTQ attacks are common in many African countries, and Kenya is no exception. The queer community here faces high levels of violence, from online bullying to physical assault and killings. Activism is not for the faint-hearted, especially if you're fighting for queer rights. How did Mary-Liz find themselves doing this? They first faced anti-LGBT violence in school.
Because I was pretty much a tomboy, right? And the accusations of me being a lesbian were off the charts.
Many times, Mary-Liz will find themselves in the headmistress's office.
At some point, my mom even had to come to school to be asked all those questions and all that.
Concerns about students in high school being queer, including boarding schools, are very common in Kenya. And a significant amount of discrimination has come from the Kenyan government itself. In 2023, Education Cabinet Secretary Ezekiel Machogu said he was working to end what he called an infiltration of an LGBTQ agenda in Kenyan schools. For Mary-Liz, the bullying was difficult.
Being queer means operating on a level of fear all the time.
Now, Mary-Liz has become an activist, albeit a reluctant one.
Fighting chose me. I don't enjoy the fighting. I fight because it's the only option.
LGBTQ activists in Kenya like Mary-Liz are fighting a lot of laws and winning some major victories. Last year, the Kenyan Supreme Court ruled that LGBTQ organizations can register as non-profits. This is because they have the freedom to associate. This was the final ruling in a decade-long litigation battle, first filed by the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, or NGLHRC.
The ruling and the reaffirmation of the ruling, because it was taken back to court. Yeah. The reaffirmation of the ruling was the fact that queer organizations exist in this country and they can operate as valid legal organizations in this country.
This is Ivy Werimba, a communications officer at GALC Plus, a coalition of 16 membership-based LGBTQ plus organizations from across Kenya.
The Constitution of Kenya, in the way that it's built, it covers all Kenyans. So as long as you were born Kenyan, you are valid as a human being and you're protected under the Constitution and especially the Bill of Rights.
While the Supreme Court ruling was a significant step forward for the LGBTQ movement in Kenya, there wasn't much time for celebration. Instead, Ivy says many people in Kenya opposed the court's decision, especially from religious circles.
Hundreds of Muslims and conservative Christians in Kenya's capital rallied Friday outside the Supreme Court to protest its decision last month to reaffirm the LGBTQ community's right of association, saying that the verdict condoned immorality.
There was a lot of backlash that came from it, and there were outcries for violence, there were outcries for people to get deported, as if we are not Kenyans again. There were outcries for conversion practices, which is where someone comes and there's concerted effort to change your identity. We got it on both ends. So we weren't able to fully celebrate and be happy about our win, because as quickly as that happened, we also needed to figure out the safety and security of our community.
There has been a recent rise in attacks on LGBTQ plus people in Kenya. Ivy's organization, GALC Plus, has witnessed this firsthand.
Last year we handled over 1,000 security cases. And these are the ones that were reported to GALC Plus. It's important that this LGBTQ plus organizations exist and that they are out there and they are loud as they can possibly be, because a lot of harm is happening and nobody's having those conversations.
Additionally, the law has its limitations in terms of protecting the LGBTQ community, specifically in some sections of the criminal code.
The problem starts when we enter into the penal code, which is a remnant of colonial times. And when you examine them, it's mostly about behavior and it's not about the person. So we even say sometimes that any adult who's having consensual sex above the age of 18, you're most likely doing something that's wrong according to the penal code.
Beyond working to change laws and penal codes, LGBTQ activism in Kenya is also helping young queer people feel more comfortable being themselves and sharing their stories. That includes Joanne. They're a member of Queer Republic, which you heard about at the top.
If I really do get in between a hard place and a rock, I can get friends who can help me out. So I feel like I'm at a better place than I was in high school.
Despite this positive feedback, Joanne still finds it difficult to exist as a queer person in a lot of public spaces.
I will see a heterosexual couple holding hands in town, holding hands in public places, hugging in public places without getting smug looks or such. That is one of the things I'm usually most jealous of the straight community. So the only time we get to have the public affection is maybe when we're in a specific community event where it's just us and allies. So it's so hard just existing a normal human.
Building relationships with other queer people helps in reducing feelings of social isolation. Queer Republic currently has 200 members.
I feel like when I'm in the outside world, I always have to have my guard up, like really high. But the minute I am surrounded by other queer folks, it's like paradise in a way. It is just beautiful because there's no judgments. I think what I would say especially for young queer folks, get yourself a community. There's a lot that is being offered out there, and trust me, you will highly benefit from it.
For the hidden economics of remarkable women, I'm Eunice Maina.
You just heard a bit about the Kenyan Supreme Court ruling last year that allows LGBTQ organizations to register as nonprofits. One of the lead advocates behind this legal victory was Eric Gitari, co-founder of the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. He was the one who filed the lawsuit that launched this legal battle in 2013. We'll hear from Gitari as he reflects on the case and its economic and social impact after the break. Welcome back to The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, a production of Foreign Policy. I'm Rena Ninan. Before the break, you heard from activists fighting for LGBTQ rights in Kenya. In many ways, they follow in the footsteps of our next guest, Eric Gitari. He's a lawyer and co-founder of the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. When he wanted to register his organization as a nonprofit, that sparked a 10-year battle.
A lot of things were going on. Uganda was passing their new anti-homosexuality bill. So was Nigeria passing the same-sex marriage prohibition bill. And there were similar proposals in the Kenyan parliament. That's why I decided that we'd rather make home fireproof than go on fighting fire. So start an advocacy institution and engage in strategic litigation, legal aid, civic education, and all these programs that would not only strengthen the community in Kenya, but also make sure that it leads up to law reform.
What was it like also being a member of the community? What was it like as you were founding it?
It was a scary time then because a lot of people were really closeted and there was no institution that was registered using the words gay and lesbian in Kenya. Institutions were very careful about being public on LGBT programming at that time. We just wanted to participate in our democracy as equal citizens. And so we sought registration.
When you set up your organization, you really wanted to provide legal aid and do so in an impactful way for litigation. What was your litigation strategy, and how do you think you could expand LGBTQ rights in Kenya now, particularly given Kenya's homosexuality laws?
The strategy was to engage in public interest litigation, engage in litigating on rights. And one of the foremost rights was the freedom to associate. We are a democracy that has gone through many difficult periods to get to democracy. And so because there was a context in the Kenyan history of being repressed by the colonial authorities that you could not associate across tribes, being repressed post-independence by the founding president, that you can't have opposition parties, having human rights activists and or dissidents either tortured, killed, exiled, or disappeared. There was a very, very contextual backdrop within our democracy that accommodated that right and made it very foremost and critical to viewing ourselves as a democratic country. And so that's the first right that we went for, the freedom to associate in a manner that is recognized by the state like any other citizens.
And one of your recent big successes was in 2023. Your 10-year lawsuit paved the way for LGBTQ organizations to be able to register as nonprofits. That was a big deal. And most significantly, the Kenyan Supreme Court ruled that LGBTQ organizers can actually register as nonprofits because they have the, quote, freedom to associate, which you talk about. Tell us the whole story about this lawsuit.
So in 2012, when I co-founded the National Gay Lesbian Human Rights Commission, we tried registration with the NGO Coordination Board, and they obstructed us by refusing to reserve the name that I would propose several times. So I would say National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Observancy, National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Office. So the gay and lesbian words were a constant feature in the names that I wanted to be reserved. And right down below the suggested names, denied, rejected, or denied. So when I sought a meeting with one of them, who was a legal officer, he actually told me to just change the name of the organization and go on to do your gay work. Just don't have the words gay and lesbian appearing in the organization name. But I refused to do that. And I told him to put it into writing, and he refused to. And I thought that was a blatant abuse of state power. He can't give me reasons, he's rude, and he is not following the Constitution. I got a lawyer who was able to get written reasons from the NGO Coordination Board, and the reasons were very telling. The first one was because we are criminalized, policy dictates that we can't associate, because if they register us, that would be tantamount to recognizing gay and lesbian relationships. Reason number two, there is no same-sex marriage allowed in the Kenyan Constitution. I mean, who was asking for marriage in registering an NGO? Unrelated. Reason number three, there's no explicit mention of sexual orientation in the Constitution when it comes to the enumerated grounds that are protected from discrimination. And then reason number four was that neither Parliament nor the judiciary has given any pathway or clear guidance on what to do on the status of LGBT human rights in Kenya. And so, in my opinion, it was the first time that we were having a state officer write to queer people, explaining to them formally in writing with all the state trappings of power, explaining why queer people cannot be equal in Kenya. And so we had to challenge that official communication in the High Court, and that's how the case started. I just went to court, and it took 10 years, but we won at the High Court, at the Court of Appeal, and at the Supreme Court.
You got this huge win, but it was not met without opposition. In fact, mainly from the evangelical churches, conservative politicians. One person, a presiding bishop at Christ is the Answer Ministry, said that this ruling would, quote, embolden other illegal practitioners like pedophiles and others involved in incest to, unquote, also have the right of association. So what was it like? You've come off this historic win that took you a decade to achieve. And then within your community, there's this massive public backlash. How did you deal with that?
We simply decided to lay low, but of course, emotionally, it had consequences. As we speak today, we're still not registered, though the decision stands.
You're not registered?
No, they refuse to obey the court order.
So you're trying to be strategic with the other cases you're juggling, and that's why you're not pursuing further legal action for people who aren't, allowing this law to take hold.
Correct. Because I was going to say our strategy is more incremental litigation towards decriminalization or legal reform.
So in 2016, you set out to decriminalize being LGBTQ, which is illegal in Kenya's penal code. Can you first explain how this law has colonial roots, and what was it like for you filing this litigation? I'm curious what the current state of this lawsuit is.
The law was brought to Kenya by the British colonial authorities. The law started getting implemented or used around the 1990s thereabout. The reason that I challenged this law was not only because of its colonial history, but the effect and the impact it was having. And so I felt the urgency to move to court, to ask questions. My thing has always been asking questions in court. So I asked, why was this law still being implemented in Kenya when we have these rights which say that if there's a law that limits fundamental rights, then that law should be declared unconstitutional. And that's what I was asking for. And we lost at the High Court. The High Court said in 2019 that they must consider the cultural values of the Kenyan people, which doesn't make sense because the Kenyan people don't have a culture on their sexuality.
So much of this podcast, Eric, is focused on economics, economic opportunities for people whose society might not consider need that opportunity. What do you think the financial impact of being LGBTQ in Kenya means? Does it make it harder for people to get work?
It does. Evidence keeps showing that people are discriminated while LGBT people are discriminated while seeking work and while working. They're fired, they are dismissed, they are denied promotions. The World Bank did a study that showed that Kenya loses close to 3% of the GDP, annual GDP every year due to these laws that criminalize LGBT people. When you think about it, all these folks who are running away from African countries because of these laws, we are suffering brain drain as a continent. And a lot of my generation folks have either left the country or have chosen to marry in heterosexual marriages for their own safety and acceptance by their society or communities, especially if you live in rural areas. So it's not only the economic cost, it's a law that has multiple compound effects, not only on individuals, but on our society. We are losing too much.
You faced a lot of humiliation, including having your own therapist talk against you as a state's witness. A lot of people called you brave. How do you find this courage? And what is your advice to people around the world who are also fighting for rights?
So what I've learned is there is power in being vulnerable, like putting yourself out there, because you learn not only how much you can withstand, but you also learn to go through short-term discomfort for long-term goals. You learn something about yourself and about your spirit, how it cannot be broken by state power or by therapists who betray you or by family members who shame you. There is more value and benefit than the risk and the losses. There will be losses and risks, but if you stay the course, the rewards are greater than the risk. It's scary, but people need to know that it can be done. And once you stand and start asking questions, you'll find allies and you won't be alone.
Eric, you fought so hard for LGBTQ rights. You've had big wins, you've had losses that are heartbreaking. How do you explain to our listeners where Kenya is today with LGBTQ rights?
Kenya is in a complex, dynamic stage of change. There's been a lot of social progress and legal progress, regardless of a few setbacks, such as the loss in the decriminalization case. A lot of people are now able to come out without fear. A lot of groups have formed and people are able to organize in grassroots areas, including rural areas. There's a sense of pride, especially across the new generation. I'm now part of the dinosaurs of the LGBT movement. I'm too old. The young generation is absolutely blazing and really brave in their approaches.
So you have hope.
I have a lot of hope for the future. Actually, I think by, let's say, 2050, let's call it Vision 2050, Kenya will be considering civil marriage equality for same-sex couples.
2050, that's still a long ways away.
Yeah, sometimes the changes that we seek, we might not see them in our lifetimes, but the work that we do is sometimes to we leave traces of records and evidence for others to come and run with it and push change to the next level.
Eric Guattari, I want to thank you very much for joining us on this episode.
Thank you very much for having me.
Next week on the podcast, we'll discuss the state of girls' education around the world and how smartphones could be the key to revolutionizing literacy.
Instead of 450 hours to learn, your mother tongue, you can spend 50 hours in the app.
And that does it for today's show. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is a production of Foreign Policy and is supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern University. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is hosted by me, Rena Ninen. Laura Rosbrow-Tellem is our senior producer. Rob Sachs, our managing director. Nicholas Petrie-Mitchell provided production assistance. Eunice Mina contributed reporting for this episode. Our thanks to you, and we'll be back in your feed next week.